My name is Bob. I'm the director of the JIAS Institute for Advanced Studies. We are really pleased today to have Tara Weinberg, who's going to be talking to us about buying land on credit. Now, Tara, how did we meet?
Yeah, I'm trying to.
I received an email from the archives, but
I had read your book.
Yes.
I wanted to hear something.
Yes. We met in the archives with quite happy.
Sure. Since we're a small group, maybe we could do introductions. Let's have a sense of who's in the room.
So why don't you start?
I'm John Ratley. I'm at Cambridge University and a senior fellow here at JIAS.
Oh, okay. I'm Samuel Chimanga. I'm an honors student here at UJ.
I'm a master's student.
And there's Ghana and I'm a DJ and School of Languages.
My name is Gamabomu. I just got promoted to prophet and one professor.
I am Zenan Mkulu. I'm a mining student in DJ and a friend of JIAS.
I'm Kela Mahanga. I just saw what we call the topic that was already discussed here. I was interested.
I'm Michael. I'm Tara's brother. Just happened to be in Joburg. So supporting the family. I studied linguistics and sociology, and now involved in music industry and related things. Yeah.
Good choice, like you
Thanks, you might change.
I'm Alex Weisenhouse. I'm a PhD student in political science from Harvard University.
I'm Dr. Tsepo Mulwe, in political science. I'm a postdoc fellow here at JIAS.
just had a PhD.
Great. Thank you.
We can have the wider conversation.
Yes, absolutely. Go for it. Yeah. Well, thank you so much to all of you for coming. I know it's kind of the end of the term, so I really appreciate that you took time out to join me here. This is very much work in progress. It's research that's part of my ongoing PhD in history. Whatever I'm developing here will form part of the dissertation. So I really appreciate your comments on the stage because it will help me directly in terms of what I'm writing. So before going into the seminar, I wanted to just give some background as to how I came to this work. So I'm from Cape Town originally, and I worked for 3 years at the University of Cape Town in a unit called the Land and Accountability Research Center. It used to be called the Rural Women's Action Research Program. It's located in the law faculty, and it does work around customary law, traditional courts, and land reform and land restitution. So I was assigned to doing a lot of research with land restitution claimants, specifically in the Eastern Cape and Mpumalanga. And during that time, meeting a lot of committees who represented various land restitution claims, it became clear that people were forming communal property associations or trusts for the purpose of getting land that was being transferred through land restitution. So groups of people who had been dispossessed under apartheid, who had claimed land, who wanted to own land, not necessarily as individual families or under traditional leaders, but as other collective forms, were doing so through these communal property institutions known as CPAs and trusts. And so in talking to people about where these collective property forms came from, what was interesting is that people say, well, these are new in some ways. These are post-1994 kind of legal bodies, but they also are not so foreign to us because we've been part of collective kinds of organizations for years, whether that's church groups or civic organizations. And in the case of Driefontein and Dachau, where there's not actually a land restitution claim, people there managed to resist forced removal in the 1980s. So it's kind of an unusual place in that sense. But what people there said was that, well, when the time came to form a committee to resist forced removals, this wasn't the first time we had a committee that had to coordinate things. Back in 1912, when Pixley Kaseme and the Native Farmers Association bought this land, there was a land committee in place to manage affairs. And so it was clear that land restitution in the post-1994 period is not the first time that people have had to come, being scattered in different areas to make a new community, and to make that new farming venture and make that farming venture work. So with that in mind, I got interested in looking at, okay, so there are a number of problems with land restitution claims these days, a number of communities that are struggling even once land's been restored to them. Why do those problems exist? What can we draw from historical examples of communities of black farmers who have come together and managed land as collectives? What's worked for them? What hasn't worked? So that was the kind of impetus for this project. So the PhD as a whole is a kind of long history of collective forms of property ownership in this part of Mpumalanga, Dachau and Driefontein, which is close to Piet Retief and Ermelo. It's about 3 hours from Joburg. So to begin with, I'm not very familiar with statistics and finances, so when I realized that credit was going to be a part of this project, I started to swat up a bit. And I started to read a book by David Graeber, quite a well-known book, called Debt, The Last 5,000 Years. And I came across a quote in this book which kind of speaks to what I was finding people saying in the historical documents. And this quote goes, as the great classicist Moses Finley often liked to say, in the ancient world, all revolutionary movements have a single program: cancel the debts and redistribute the land. And it struck me that this is still a very pertinent question these days, cancelling debt and redistributing land. These are not just the demands of revolutionary movements in ancient times. Redistribution of land is very much on the agenda of activists today, all over South Africa. If you think of the work of EFF and non-political party-aligned movements as well, around land redistribution, activism that has led to the promulgation of an expropriation bill, that these are very vital matters in South Africa today. But I think two of the questions that are really missing from public debate around expropriation are: who will the land go to when it is redistributed, and where will those people get the funds to make a go of that land? Because land on its own, it's very difficult to do anything with it. So if you've been scattered, if you have no assets or funds to draw upon, how do you make a go of things? And that's been a real struggle for a lot of land restitution claimants. So I think these questions are key to resolving some of the problems in our land reform program now, but they also pop up a lot in histories of how people were organizing to manage land collectively in the past. This question of access and ownership of land, and also access to credit, are often overlooked in discussions about land reform now, but also in histories of land acquisition and land struggle in the past. So what I'm also doing is trying to, with the PhD, kind of reconstruct a history of the practices and intellectual traditions that black farmers in this part of the country developed around collective property ownership. And I think doing so matters because it offers insight into some of the alternatives that people were developing to the very limiting conceptualizations of property ownership that the apartheid government tried to impose. So under apartheid, the government tried to impose this very binary system of property: individual title deeds for white people, communal land under chiefs for black people. And I think adding to some extent already existing literature on the alternative forms of property ownership that people developed really blows apart that boundary. So, as I said, for this project I'm focusing particularly as a case study on Dachau and Driefontein. You can see where they're located up there. And in this seminar I'm exploring particularly how the farmers who bought land in this area navigated credit networks in order to finance those land purchases. And I think how land buyers navigated credit networks and risk factors is a key part of the story about land and property as well. So in 1912, black farmers from around the country came to Driefontein and Dachau, that was in the Wakkerstroom district of the then Transvaal province, to buy into a collective property scheme. The scheme was set up by the Native Farmers Association, a company established by ANC founder and stalwart Pixley Kaseme, who Dr. Nkuluga has written a lot about in his biography of Seme. And in this paper, I'm looking particularly at a group of land buyers who came to Dachau from Harrismith, the district in the Free State. This group from Harrismith formed a syndicate of their own within the broader NFA syndicate. So it was almost like a land buying company within a broader land buying company. In doing so, they infused the Native Farmers Association with, I think, land practices and credit networks drawn from the experiences as sharecroppers in the Free State area, preceding the formal existence of the Native Farmers Association. And so initially, when they entered into this deal with Pixley Kaseme and became members of the Native Farmers Association, they tried to pool their resources in ways that resembled kind of mutual cooperation. But through that process came up against the long arm of finance capital and land speculators, and they adapted the form of property holding they had to meet that reality. So my key questions with this paper are, how did black farmers finance the land purchases that they made, particularly in this part of the then Transvaal? What does the history of these credit practices tell us about property dynamics, particularly the forms of land ownership that farmers chose? And what kind of politics did the intersection of property and credit in this context enable? Also, what kind of politics did it foreclose? And what do these past examples suggest about how we can study land and advise on land issues today? So first, for some context. In the 19th century, some black people living in the Cape and Natal, which were both British colonies at the time, were legally allowed to buy land within limits. But land purchased by black South Africans was outlawed in most of the Boer republics, including the Free State, where the Harrismith land buyers came from. Land purchase was possible in the Transvaal to a limited extent, usually through a trusteeship system. So this meant that individuals or groups would have to pay for land via a white land-owning institution, like a mission station, or a lawyer or a politician. A lot of groups went this route. After the South African War, where the British took over the Transvaal, government administrators accepted some of the purchases that had been made in the Transvaal by black South Africans, but they demanded that they be transferred into the name of a tribe, with the chief as the sub-trustee and the native commissioner as the main trustee. A few famous examples of this are the Bachata, in the northwest, and also the Royal Bafokeng. Other scholars have written quite a bit about the history of these two groups, of what their route of land acquisition was, basically going initially hired property under the names of missionaries, then having this later transferred into a tribal trust. So work by people like Sonabile Luana, Gavin Capps, Manson and Mbenga have a very interesting book as well on Bafokeng, worth consulting. I think it's important to note that during this period of the late 19th and early 20th century, both the British and Boer governments in the various territories that they were occupying emphasized this kind of racialized binary division between these two simplified property forms of individual title deeds and communal land tenure to chiefs. And these property forms resulted from colonial technologies of surveying, mapping, boundary making that had been pursued in particular from 1850 onwards. And they simplified customary forms of land tenure, in a sense both black and white, in that they simplified not only communal land tenure but also individual property ownership, trying to create a very monolithic system of individual title deeds that were very carefully surveyed, very tightly bounded in a way that's rare in most parts of the world. It's almost quite specific to South Africa, how intensely surveyed the land is in this country. And so any knowledge about property that fell outside of the brackets of this colonial scheme of surveying and mapping was not considered. And so while black South Africans had numerous mapping systems, ways of accounting for rights and registering rights, those forms, in the eyes of the British and Boer states, were seen as not to exist. And so they didn't register within the vision of colonial mapmakers. And this map-making process went very much hand in hand with the development of industrial capitalism and mining as well in the late 19th and early 20th century. So in general, in the early 20th century, black South Africans were excluded from having land registered in their own names, and therefore also excluded from access to this emerging industrializing economy, compelling them into working jobs for wages instead of making a living from agriculture. But what's interesting is that there seems to have been a brief window period between about 1905 and the passing of the 1913 Land Act, in which black South Africans were able to buy land in greater numbers. So in 1905, Minister Edward Sewu of the AME Church won a case in the Transvaal Supreme Court, which made it possible for black people to register land in their own names. And Sewu's victory meant that after 1905 and before 1913, black land buyers in the Transvaal were limited less by the law and more by whether they had the funds or connections to acquire land. And so here the history of credit access and property ownership becomes very much intertwined. Those who were able to buy land during this period were usually of a higher class and status relative to other black South Africans in both urban areas like Everton and Alexandria, and rural areas like Driefontein and Dachauer. The land buyers tended to come from two main backgrounds. They were mission-educated farmers or intellectuals from Natal and wealthy sharecroppers from the Free State and the Transvaal. The majority of black South Africans couldn't afford to buy land during this period, and so they lived as rent payers on land that was legally owned by white companies, individuals, and the government. So between 1905 and 1913, hundreds of black individuals and syndicates, the kind of companies like the Native Farmers Association, bought land in urban and rural parts of the Transvaal. In the Wakkerstroom district, where Driefontein and Dachauer are located, black land buyers owned about 6,500 hectares of land, which meant that in this district, it was the largest proportion of black land out of any district in the Transvaal. So the role of the Native Farmers Association and Pixie Assembly is very clear. It had a huge impact on land that black South Africans were able to buy. The literature thus far on black land buyers suggests that most syndicates financed their purchases through the sale of livestock and crops. So particularly sharecroppers would sell off some of their livestock, pool some of the savings from that, and use it to buy land. People also pulled savings from wage labor. In addition, there were other places, other parts of the country or other parts of the Transvaal where chiefs instituted levies to try and raise money to buy land. And these factors definitely all contributed to the funds required for land purchases. But in most cases, even when people did go through these processes, they were not able to buy land outright in a single sum. So very few people nowadays, as in the past, can just buy a house in one sum without actually taking out a loan. And this was the case for the land buyers in Driefontein and Dachauer. They needed to rely on some form of credit or loans. The anthropologist Deborah James argues that for much of the 20th century, black South Africans were living under what she terms credit apartheid. So during the apartheid period, it was almost impossible for black South Africans to gain access to credit through formal avenues like bank loans. And James argues that this meant that there was a proliferation of other informal credit practices like saving groups, burial societies, stokvels, money lending, shop credit schemes, and so on. But it seems that during this window period in which black South Africans could legally buy land in the Transvaal, 1905 to 1913, it seems that this was also a window period in which banks and other formal lending institutions were more willing to lend to black farmers who wanted to buy land. So it's likely that for a lot of these banks and businesses, most of them white capital, they weren't just doing this altruistically. They saw this window of opportunity as a chance to make good money from a class of black farmers who were doing fairly well at this point. between 1908 and 1914, the average interest rates on mortgages for white people buying big properties like farms was between 6 and 8%. For black land buyers, the rates were higher, between 8 and 10%. And this is ironic, considering that at the time, a lot of the sources show that white land sellers remarked that they thought black farmers were more likely to be able to pay off their loans than white farmers, because black farmers were more successful farmers in a lot of places. So this was the kind of context in which Pixie Kaseme bought land in the Transvaal. In order to do so, he took out mortgages from 3 companies, all of which were owned by an American movie tycoon called I.W. Schlesinger. I think the other point that I want to make with regard to figuring out how people were able to buy land in this area is that we shouldn't look only at the moment at which people bought land, the moment which I call the moment of contract, in which people sign over for a title deed. So in his work on credit networks in Somalian piracy, an anthropologist, Jatin Dua, argues that, quote, guarantees of friendship, trustworthiness, and reputation associated with existing social networks predate and undergird the moment of contract, end quote. So in other words, there are a whole lot of social obligations and relationships that people have prior to actually signing a contract, acquiring a title deed, which are then brought into the legal sphere upon the signing of that contract. And so in this paper, a lot of what I'm looking at is how the prior world of the land buyers from the Free State, the kind of networks that they had with financiers and lawyers and other money lenders were brought to bear on their relationships as members of this Native Farmers Association community. And I think that the bringing together of these old and new networks in 1912 in the Wakkerstroom district made possible this kind of collective landholding project that the NFA developed. So what I'm going to present here is sort of divided into 2 time periods. The first is 1912 until 1919, when Pixie Kaseme was very much involved with the Native Farmers Association. And I think he and the other directors, a lot of other well-known black lawyers and intellectuals, played a major role in developing the kind of community that emerged there. After 1919, there's a break in the sense that Schlesinger, who financed the company, ousts Seme as director, as well as the other black directors. And so the NFA continues to run for several more decades, but it's run by Schlesinger as a kind of property business, in which he's still continuing to make quite a lot of money out of black farmers through interest rates and so on. So the analysis that I'm going to offer is divided into these 2 periods. And I'm going to focus first mostly on the period of Pixie Kaseme. The other thing that I wanted to point out about this area, actually, that's very interesting, is that it is at a kind of crossroads. So you can see it's pretty close to, if you look at the map on the left, it's very close to the border with Free State, Natal, and what was then the Transvaal. So it's also very close to Swaziland. It's quite easy to get to Mozambique. So it was a kind of key area in which people were traveling, and in which goods and produce was being exported as well. So from Seme's point of view, this was a really good location. It was close enough to Johannesburg, but it was also very close to other places where there were long traditions of successful black farmers, like in the Free State and Natal. The other interesting thing about this area is that because it's at a kind of crossroads, people there, when interviewing people there, they don't describe a strong sense of a kind of ethnic consciousness associated with, say, a Zulu ethnic identity, which other scholars have found in relation to land buying syndicates in Natal. For instance, syndicates in Natal that relied on a sort of philosophy of self-help bound up with a sense of Zulu ethnic identity. In Dachau and Driefontein, it's very fluid. There were Zulu speakers, Swati speakers, Sotho speakers. People came from all over, and they formed this farming community together. So from that point of view, it's also very interesting in that it's a very kind of cosmopolitan farming community, and one that people really fought for in the 1980s in particular, when the apartheid government wanted to forcibly remove people, some people to Kangwane, some people to KwaZulu, some people to Kwakwa. So there was like this fight against, well, we don't identify in that way with this kind of Bantustan project. So how do people actually finance the land purchase of Daggakraal and Driefontein? And I want to go through some of the details of how they did that. So Dr. Kulunga narrates the history in his biography of Pixie Kaseme of Seme's involvement with this businessman, I.W. Schlesinger. And he offers really vital insights into Seme's credit dealings. My understanding of Seme's credit practices are very much built upon your book and your analysis. And I think I then build upon your findings to explore the role played by other figures who are also involved with building the Native Farmers Association. So other lawyers in addition to Seme, the role of land buyers who bought into Seme's scheme, finances, and so on. So when Seme originally founded the NFA, he founded it in Natal in 1909. And in this first iteration, the directors of the company were all black. In order to finance this initial company in Natal, Seme took out a mortgage of £14,000 from one of Schlesinger's companies. But over the years, the NFA was, in Schlesinger's view, not making adequate progress towards paying off this loan, and so Seme applied for another loan from Schlesinger to try and cover that. Schlesinger agreed, but on the condition that the NFA moved to the Transvaal, and that Schlesinger would be allowed to put in place what he called some shadow directors, who were white directors, in addition to the black directors that Seme had selected. And so in 1912, Seme moved the NFA to the Transvaal. He took out a mortgage from one of Schlesinger's companies, the Colonial Banking and Trust Company, for £1,300. And I think Seme gambled on being able to pay back this loan by making the NFA an economic success. He had a huge vision for it, expanding beyond just Daggakraal and Driefontein. This could be a way for black farmers to protect themselves from. He was aware of the kind of ongoing discussions which eventually led to the 1913 Land Act, and so he thought it would be possible to establish a kind of self-sufficient black farming community. He also built in a mechanism to recoup some of that debt. So, for instance, although he bought one of the farms for £3 per morgan, he ended up selling it to land buyers for £7 per morgan. So he was trying to make a profit in order to pay off the loans, amongst other things. So that's Seme. Then Schlesinger. Who was Schlesinger? That's him on the bottom left. So Schlesinger is most well known for his financing of most of the first movie houses and cinemas in South Africa, including here in Joburg. He also owned a very famous citrus estate, the Zebedela citrus estate. But he actually began his career in the 1890s in South Africa by selling life insurance to black and white South Africans. And after the South African War, he returned to South Africa to start his own company, the African Realty Trust, which bought up land and built housing in a number of Joburg suburbs, Houghton, Killarney, Orange Grove, and so on. So this was Schlesinger's house and headquarters, which is still in Killarney today. It's off of this park. And it was quite funny because I live in a flat in Killarney, and so the whole year I've been walking in this park, walking past this building, not realizing that it was built and owned by Schlesinger. So the past I'm studying feels like literally layered upon the present that I walk in every day. So Schlesinger ran his own mortgage bond office. According to historian Neil Parsons, who's written mostly about the cinema empire that Schlesinger created, quote, "The secret to Schlesinger's success was giving salary earners an opportunity to buy their homes on an installment basis." This is absolutely key, because this was Schlesinger and Seme's model for the Native Farmers Association. So people would buy a piece of land and they would pay it off in installments over, say, a decade. But obviously, interest rates will be charged through that process. In 1905, Schlesinger created the Colonial Bank Trust Company of Africa, And in particular, he used this bank to target black customers. So they offered savings accounts to black customers. And a number of articles appear in Seme's newspaper, Abantu Bato, between 1912 and 1920, advising prospective land buyers, various readers. The ads are written in both Zulu and Sesotho, and they're advising them to visit Schlesinger's bank because they say this is the best deal for black consumers looking to take out loans or open a savings account. So one of the ads is up here on the top right. This was Schlesinger's banking office. And that image comes from Abantu Bato, Seme's newspaper. So the families who joined the Native Farmers Association scheme bought plots that were in size about 10 morgen. And the morgen is such a strange unit of measurement because it's very specific to South Africa. So it's taken me a while to figure out how to convert it into something more understandable. But consensus seems to be that it's around 8.5, 10 morgen would be about 8.5 hectares, which is about 10.5 soccer pitches, which is a language that I can get with. And they bought these plots for between 200 and 600 pounds. As I mentioned, they put down a deposit, initial installment, and then they would pay off the rest over several years. So to fund the initial down payment, they would pool resources gleaned from previous farming ventures, sell livestock. Many people also actually took employment with the NFA as messengers or trying to promote the company, going around the country promoting it. So the archival evidence on credit practices is particularly rich for the Harrismith land buyers. This is the group on which I'm going to focus. They tended to come from fairly well-off sharecropper stock. They were very skilled farmers who shared the risks and rewards of farming with other sharecropping families, as well as the white landowner, who kind of, according to the legal register, owned the land on which they farmed. They would offer some of their produce to the white landowner in exchange for the right to farm there without being disturbed. And so there was an absence, in some sense, of a monetary relationship involved in sharecropping, in that people would pay the farmer in produce. And I think that's quite interesting because I think it played some role in the kinds of obligations that sharecroppers developed with one another. For instance, Tim Keegan, who writes a lot about Free State sharecroppers, argues that when a family of sharecroppers left the farm, often other families would follow. And so in this sense, when a group of families settled on a new farm, they would assist each other to set up a kind of new farming setup and favorable relations with the white farm owner. And so as a result, there were kind of bonds of labor and kinship that were developed through this process. And this is what the Free State sharecroppers may have brought with them when they moved to Driefontein and Dachauer. In the context of the 1913 Land Act, a lot of sharecroppers in the Free State found the bonds that they had with the white farm owners broken when these owners turned on them in the context of the Act. And in response to that, many of them formed companies or syndicates of sharecroppers, and they sought out land to buy in other parts of the country. So syndicates bought land all over what used to be the Transvaal, actually. So other places that you may have heard of, which were also the sites of quite famous forced removals, resistance, places like Mogopa, Matupistat, Klipgat, and then urban places as well. So syndicates bought land in and around Piet Retief, in Everton as well, near Joburg, and of course in Dachauer. So in 1913, 200 people arrived from Harrismith, sharecropping families, to buy land in Dachauer. In 1913, Seme's company, the NFA, had bought the farm for £11,000, thanks to a bond from one of Schlesinger's companies. And Seme then sold that land to the Harrismith Group for £34,000, so making quite a profit out of it. There were about 25 families who were involved in that land purchase. Among them was the family of Maite Popo Moloi, who was a local chief. Seme had been in discussions with the members of this group for many years, and all of them had apparently put money towards the purchase. But when the moment of contract arrived and actually signing over this title deed, Seme signed the deed of sale in the name of Chief Moloi alone. So there was risk in buying this land collectively, but there was also security in doing so. By purchasing land together, dealing with potential losses together, the group could perhaps secure some protection from the effects of economic downswings. They could also maintain a space in a commercial farming market that was becoming increasingly dominated, largely due to government subsidies and support by white farming families. What really struck me about this, both when reading your book, Bongani, and when looking at it in the archives, was that the families from Harrismith stated their intention to buy this land in Dachapral in what they called undivided shares. So this meant that they would manage and use the land in common, although obviously there would be an agreement as to which families would have priority to which pieces of land. This kind of system could only really succeed if you already have working relationships of trust. A working set of norms that would govern land, that could be used to hold people to account if they did not stick to the kind of agreement on who had priority to which land. And I think the decades of farming had given the Harrison group, must have given them a base where they felt confident to embark on this kind of property scheme. So I think what's interesting is that buying as a syndicate for this group therefore enabled a certain kind of politics which carved out a kind of alternative to that very binary form that I mentioned was in place as a result of surveying prior to apartheid and during apartheid. So this was a way in which this group could carve out a cooperative way of financing and managing land in a system of racial capitalism which sought to exclude them. For that reason, I think it's worth flagging. But despite this foundation that the Harrismith Syndicate had established with this kind of alternative political possibility, ultimately this scheme of theirs, of undivided shares, went unrecognized by both Seme and by the white establishment. So when Chief Molloy defaulted on one of the payments for his installments for the land, the NFA, including Seme, declared the whole Harrismith Syndicate's contract to be broken because the deed had been, of sale had been signed in the name of Chief Molloy alone. And so everyone in the group, all 25 families, would forfeit their land. Seme defended this decision by arguing that the residents were all members of Chief Molloy's tribe, stating, quote, "I know that an individual member of a tribe has no right to land. There is no individual tenure," end quote. But in this belief in Chief's power over land, Seme was challenged vociferously by the Harrismith land buyers. So one of these, Jonas Molloy, remarked, quote, "I know the native tribal customs. Dachapral was not bought in the name of a chief. It was bought in the name of 23 to 24 men, and I was one of those men." The court case of Case Lamini versus Monapisi Sehlako, which is a case involving one of the Harrismith land buyers versus another land buyer from Natal, brings a lot of these dissenting voices to the fore. It's a fascinating look at the kind of debate going on within the farm association. What this case also brings to the fore, though, is that while the Harrismith group was disputing the loss of their land through this format, the NFA began selling the land that they'd already handed to them to other land buyers who had arrived from Natal. So there was, in essence, a kind of double sale going on. There's a question which we can discuss. I'd be interested to hear people's thoughts, but which I'm not going to go into here, of why Seme took this approach when he had advocated individual title deeds for a long time and had been a very strong proponent of them. Perhaps it was for convenience sake, perhaps it was because in certain contexts he genuinely believed in traditional leaders' powers over land, opposed to other members of the group. But either way, the Harrismith group's trust in Seme was broken when this incident happened. One of the people that I spoke to in Dachapral is Catherine Madlala, who's pictured here. She grew up in Dachapral. Her grandparents bought land in Dachapral. But in the 1950s, they had defaulted on installments for the payment of their land, and so they were evicted, and they ended up moving to Driefontein and buying land again in Driefontein. So she remembers her grandparents telling this story of betrayal. She says that they were misled first by Seme, also by Chief Molloy, and then later by Schlesinger and other moneylenders. What's fascinating is, and I think quite common to a lot of land buyers, is that she describes how her family had to buy the same plot of land 3 times over. So they bought it in 1913 when they arrived from Harrismith. Then in 1916, when there was this dispute between the Harrismith land buyers and the land buyers from Natal, who the company had sold the same land to, the NFA agreed to resell the land to individual families from Harrismith instead of to the collective. And so then Mama Lalo's family had to buy this land again. Then in 1923, they had to buy this land a 3rd time because when Schlesinger took over the company, he instituted a new agreement again for land buyers. And so these multiple payments put her family into huge debt from which it's clear they're still struggling to recover today. A number of the land buyers in Dachau, as a result of this, partly because of, I think, this incident, expressed their desire to hold land as individual families rather than as a collective. So, for instance, Alexander Dlamini and Andres Tongwane were both founders, originally members of the NFA leadership and some of the first land buyers in Dachau. And they had also bought land in Dachau too, where the Harrismith land buyers had bought. And this was in 1920. Alexander Dlamini remarked, "Initially we could not decide whether to have individual or collective title, but now Seme has done wrong by us and we all want individual titles." I want to point out here that there are many other parts of the country, many other parts of the Transvaal, where land buyers from the outset, black farmers wanted to buy land as individual families. So that was clearly a very strong current during this period, and other scholars have done justice to that. But I think it is interesting that there were also other philosophies of land management and land buying that people were trying to pursue within the legal system during this period. And the group from Harrismith is an example of that. In trying to assess the role of various role players, including Seme, during this period, I think I went into this project looking for kind of heroes of land management to come up with schemes that we could look to solve some of the problems now in South Africa. But I didn't really find any heroes exactly, but I don't think I necessarily found villains either. I think that, people were in very difficult and complicated positions. In trying to think through this, I again found some of David Graeber's work quite useful. So he makes this point that debt arises from a situation where, quote, there are potential equals, but they're not currently in a relationship of equality. And so while the debt remains unpaid, the logic of hierarchy takes hold and there's no reciprocity. I think it's too definite to say there was no reciprocity involved in the relationships between the land buyers and the creditors, but the point about the inequality between the creditors and the debtors is an important one. So, for example, the white farmers in the Free State who had sharecroppers living on their land held the trump card in their relationship with sharecroppers, even though they relied on sharecroppers' produce. Seme held the trump card over NFA land buyers because they depended on him for transfer of their title deed. But at the same time, Schlesinger held power over Seme because he was lending him money. So while Seme's debts remained unpaid, the rights of the land buyers also remained insecure. So it was a kind of difficult line that they were walking. So to end, I want to take us briefly to the post-1919 period to explain what happened to the life of the Native Farmers Association after Seme was ousted. So in 1919, Schlesinger repossessed the NFA after claiming it was in financial turmoil of Seme's making. In highly paternalistic tones, Schlesinger and other government administrators at the time argued that the black farmers at Driefontein and Dachau were ill-equipped to navigate such high-risk ventures. They very much opposed other black farmers from taking out mortgages. They said instead they should go for a tribal trust system. But yet Schlesinger continued to run the Native Farmers Association for decades afterwards, and people kept on buying land in this area, and land kept changing hands. So the question is, how are people able to buy land, especially during the apartheid period where credit was so hard to come by. Obviously, for a lot of people, it was difficult to hold onto their land that they bought in 1913. For instance, the family of Catherine Madala that I mentioned. So either people lacked money or they lacked trust in paying a company that seemed to demand that they pay again and again and again. But it's understandable that some people, what I heard from some people was that actually their families boycotted paying because they were so frustrated with having to pay again and again. But those who were involved with continuing to pay their installments found that they came into contact again and again with this fascinating network of lawyers, black and white. So Seme remained involved with the NFA even after he was officially ousted. And then there were a number of lawyers who worked in neighboring towns who acted not only as lawyers but also as kind of credit intermediaries. So two of these lawyers that I found just kind of by chance were Cyril Kershaw Barry and W.B. Skuman, who ran a law firm in the town of Wakkerstroom, which is today a kind of like tourist town in this area. Barry is interesting in that Cyril Kershaw Barry actually represented the Harrismith land buyers in the case of Sehlako. And so he had quite a long involvement with people there. In that case, he was arguing that the Harrismith land buyers had rights which should not have been overrun by the title deed being signed in the name of Chief Malone alone. But in the years that followed, Barry began to be the legal representative for Schlesinger's company, for the Native Farmers Association. So he was often the one who people would go and pay in the town of Wakkerstroom. So Barry and Skuman would take a cut of the payment in installments. They would then pass on those funds to Schlesinger and the Native Farmers Association. There are also instances of Barry and Skuman giving loans to people who wanted to buy land, and then those people paying them directly. So it's interesting that these were both lawyers and creditors. And I think part of what they also show is that they challenge us to look beyond the moment of the title deed being signed, the moment of contract, because the relationships that kind of defined how people managed land and how they paid went long after the moment of contract. So this is an example from one of these books by Skuman and Barry. It was a ledger. So it's kind of hard to read. You can see over here. So these are the payments that are coming in. These are the installments that people are paying. And you can see that the debit and credit columns are pretty similar. So what's happening is that money is going straight into the account books of these lawyers and straight out to the Native Farmers Association. I was lucky enough to get hold of this ledger that belonged to Barry and Skuman. And what's also interesting is that the Native Farmers Association probably makes up about half of their business for the period between 1920 and 1940. So it's clear that a lot of people were actually making really good money out of this community of black farmers. At the same time, the community itself was becoming increasingly isolated as a result of subsidies to white farmers. So often what happened was when people were unable to pay, to fully pay up for the land, it was advertised and other black farmers came in and bought that land. So one of the examples I found of how people were able to do that in the context of apartheid was through a colleague of mine at Wits history workshop, Dr. Ali Hlongwane. So his father, Daniel Hlongwane, bought land in Driefontein in the mid-1950s. And he did so through a loan from his employer, the bus company, PACO. And he worked for the company for about 30 years, but he was able to get the loan quite early on when he began working for the company. And what seems to have happened is that throughout his years working for the company, PACO deducted funds from his monthly salary as well as from his pension fund. So as his employer, they had access to all of his financial information, and they were able to calibrate interest rates based on that. So one of the things I'm trying to figure out, and I'd be interested to hear from people if you've heard of this, if anyone knows of other examples where people were getting loans from their employers and how are those loans being deducted and so on. There were also individual money lenders, some of them very, very dodgy. So one, for example, was a money lender from Joburg called Nathan Evans, who loaned money to people in Dachauer and Driefontein, but also to a lot of people in Everton who bought land. And eventually in 1941, he was hauled before the courts for basically lending money to Black South Africans at interest rates that were like incredibly high. The last point I want to make is that the story I've told so far has mostly featured the names of men. But women played a vital part in this kind of story of credit networks. It's just that it's quite hard to find that evidence in the government archives. But in oral history interviews that I did with people, they talked often of the roles that their grannies had played in taking the lead in farming enterprises in Dachauer and Driefontein, but that often the grandmothers were not in a position to get credit in their own names because they didn't have a source of formal employment like their grandfathers had, like a wage job or something, and they didn't have their names on title deeds. So this limited their ability to apply for credit in their own names. But in particular from the 1970s onwards, a lot of people I spoke to talked of women's savings groups, which became intimately linked with the movement to resist forced removals in the 1980s, which is going to be a subject of another chapter. So I think, in conclusion, the story of Driefontein and Dachauer is fascinating. It's about how land claimants navigated financing credit networks to hold on to land and to acquire it. It's also, I think, a story about how we breathe life into understanding some of the challenges of land restitution and land reform. So it begs the question of what are the credit options available to the beneficiaries of land restitution or land redistribution. So it takes us beyond just asking what does it mean to own land or focusing just on acquiring land. I think it makes it incumbent upon us to also look at how credit is tied up with making a success out of land restitution and farming. So I think legal ownership shouldn't be the end goal of demands in terms of the land reform program. It should really just be a part of the process. We need to go beyond just ownership to other kinds of support that can be offered to farmers through this program. I think if we look only at the moment of ownership, of acquisition, we limit our imaginaries of the kinds of politics that people have developed historically around land. So thanks, I look forward to your comments.
Well, thank you very much for this fascinating presentation. Colleagues, ask questions, comment. Yes, so if you can introduce yourself again. Yeah.
So if I introduce myself again, I'm Dr. Tsapo Moloi. So thank you for the presentation. A couple of questions. Firstly, in your on-field research, were you able to get an opportunity to speak to the chief of Dachauer? Because he's in charge of all three, Perdekop, Driefontein, and Dachauer. That's my first question. I didn't hear in the entire presentation any reference to the Committee of 12. I don't know if you're aware of this. If you could just touch on that. There's a recent case in KZN where they just lost, I think the government lost the matter to the indigenous people in that area, and they're paying it off. I don't know if you're familiar with it, where Hilton College is based. If you could just say something to that, if you know of it. And then, so you speak of Chief Popo Moloi, that's my great-great-grandfather, right? And There's somebody I thought you would touch on, since your research is current, and I'm not sure if I remember the name coming out in Dr. Longana's book, Mr. Jackie Twala. Right. If you could maybe say a word or two about him.
Sure.
So that we could be on the same page.
Sure.
I think let me stop there so that I allow other colleagues to speak.
Any other questions? Yes?
Let me just ask, what were they farming? What was the rainfall? What was it? Was it a good farming area? Compared to, if you think of places now like Balfour, Stanton, which are very dry. I mean, was there something? Was it good? I mean, was it area, land that people wanted? Because there's a lot of areas that are actually bad for farming.
Right.
And I mean, if you think of where the other Free State farmers came from, there was that group around Crocodile and Vicksburg that people have written about that were very successful.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just thinking of the sort of nitty-gritty of what they were farming.
I'd like to find out about the conditions that drove the people to that area, because you mentioned that it was a very metropolitan type of farming condition where people from various settlements came. So what are the conditions that made them come into that space?
Yes, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Joseph Langeni, and I'm a student here at UJ. I'd just like to add on to the gentleman and the lady's comments over here. I come from a place called Pitrati, which is less than 80 kilometers from the place that you're talking about. I did not hear anyone, or you in particular, speak about a natural structure called Hayswap Dam, which is that dam where these particular places are located. Could you just add your input regarding that?
But if you can answer that, we can take
Sure. Yeah, thanks for these very good questions. So first to Dr. Molloy, I actually have set up interviews to speak to the chief in a couple of weeks, so I haven't got around to it yet. I was introduced first to the people in Driefontein, and I've slowly been trying to make my way around to interviewing people in Dachau. But I would love to talk to you more about that and other people who you think it might be useful for me to interview. The Committee of 12, yes, Jackie Twala actually has told me a lot about this committee. A fascinating structure. One of the things that I've struggled to get a sense of, and maybe you can also help by stating here, is when the committee was actually established. Was it a more recent structure that came about around the time of resisting forced removals and trying to establish a community authority, or was it a committee that was established initially with representatives from each of the parts of Dachau, Driefontein, Vlakplaas, etc., to advise the Native Farmers Association? So I'm still trying to get clarity on that. The kind of governance structures will probably be another chapter, which I'm still working on. So I want to talk more about the Committee of 12 in relation to that, in relation to how people manage and govern land. I've heard of what's going on at Hilton College, but I don't know enough about it to say more on it here. So I would need to read up on that first. Jackie Twala, so Jackie Twala is, so he's based in Dachau, and he's doing very interesting work around heritage there, as far as I know. So there's a statue which I showed in one of these photos, which is located near Dachau Primary School, the statue of Pixie Kaseme. So I know that Jackie Twala has been sort of advocating very hard for a lot of heritage-related initiatives in that area. So I've spoken to him in that capacity, hearing about the heritage projects and the Committee of 12 and so on. But it's only now that I'm beginning to get other contacts in Dachau to also talk to. So I look forward to seeing how my perspective changes based on that. Yes, so the question of farming. From what I can figure out, it was an excellent area for farming. Pretty good rainfall. I think that people farmed, I know that maize was a big crop. They had a granary that they built during the time of the NFA. A number of granaries that people would then use together. So it seemed like it was a place where people had high hopes of being able to farm very successfully. And I think within the first decade of buying land and farming there, they were able to farm quite successfully. A number of factors have resulted in this being a very impoverished area these days, where people mostly rely on social grants and can barely rely on any agricultural produce at all. So one of those factors is that I think it just became extremely difficult in this area to compete with the surrounding commercial farms. And together with evictions of farm workers, labour tenants, sharecroppers from surrounding farms, Driefontein and Dachauer became almost like a haven for black farmers. And so the population swelled and the owners took on many, many tenants. So it was black landowners with many black tenants. As a result, what was initially those 10.5 soccer fields became much reduced, and farming on a grand scale became very difficult. So it seems like these days mostly it's smaller kind of garden plots that people have. In a lot of cases, it's tenants rather than owners who seem to be doing a lot of the farming. As to more precise conditions around rainfall and so on, that's something that I need to attend to. I haven't really focused on those details. I kind of have a sense of the overall picture. So thanks for drawing my attention to that. The conditions that drove people to these areas. So in the Free State, I think looking at a book like Charles van Onselin's The Seed is Mine is really useful for this picture of how sharecroppers, what a difficult time sharecroppers in the Free State were having during the first half of the 20th century, how many of them had been quite successful farmers and had long-running relationships with the white landowners in these areas. And then the restrictions around the 1913 Land Act and the mobilization of other blocks of white farmers led to them cracking down on sharecropping contracts and labour tenant contracts and making it really difficult for people to survive off of that. I mean, I think the 1913 Land Act, its biggest impact was around sharecropping and labour tenancy, and not just around declaring, dividing what land could be owned by black people, what land could be owned by white people. Natal I know less about, but maybe others can guide me. I know that there were laws that were becoming more and more restrictive as well as to land ownership for black South Africans. So that may have driven people to the Transvaal, where there was still this possibility due to the Tsemu case. So those were some of the factors. Joseph, thank you for asking that. The Haysop Dam, I just want to make sure I have this right. Is that the dam that's like in Driefontein that was built in the 1980s? So yeah, so this is really interesting. I'm glad you brought this up, because that dam was kind of used as an excuse by the government for the forced removals that they were planning to implement in Driefontein and Dachauer. They said that this dam was sort of essential for the water supply of the area, that would flood the whole of Driefontein and Dachauer, and as a result, people would have to move because of the dam. The dam exists, and some people did have to move, but acquired in most cases, I think, alternative land within Driefontein and Dachauer. So yeah, the dam is like a very interesting sort of site of struggle for that reason. But please contribute if you have other insights on the dam. Thanks.
Any other questions?
This is just a sort of question kind of following up on your question and the questions that were asked about what the farming conditions were and what people farmed. Trying to build from some of my own observations of more modern context, which is kind of, have you come across anything in the archives or discussions of what to farm? and whether that is in a way related to credit. Right? It could be that your choice to farm wheat is endogenous to the fact that you aren't actually able to get a huge amount of credit. And because you can't get a huge amount of credit, you can't invest in potentially a more productive or a safer crop that could lead into sort of a cycle that is quite sort of treacherous for people. I know that a lot of the new distribution and distribution farms are going towards kind of cattle and herding and things like that, which are kind of low capital intensive farming methods that are easier to do when you don't have access to credit.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Yes.
I'd love to find out in the case of Mama Ngala and her family. I'm sure there are many families like that close to got affected by those incidents. I just want to find out were there any form of protection in terms of preventing those people to buy that land many times? If you bought once, there was no way you can show that I bought this land before, so I can continue and pay. There were no protection for the buyers already.
Good question.
My name is Barnabas. I just came late and this week and at a chance of your talk. My question is, what were really the motive behind buying these? Is there any political motivation? I see the person and politically equal, but any words they derive from such as Pixie person to say, okay, probably we want land, but maybe the power that we are very powerful.
Yeah.
Maybe we would have to try to buy instead of acquiring any forcefully or using at the time. Maybe we can have general populace and their understanding in terms of political and struggling, whatever. It was not in their minds, given maybe the threshing or whatever that they had been done prior in the 1800s. But many never thought about that, or they were afraid to come into the fore. Then he is a group of people following with some undertones who now came to the fore to buy. I'm just throwing things from.
I just want to find out, so the answer to the question was asking based on rebuying of land.
Yes.
Like the family, mother's family, they own the land, they lived on it, found on it. And when it comes to rebuying it, what was then done if they couldn't afford to rebuy it? Do they then just come off the land and give it away to whoever buys it? Or are they given the chance to actually rebuy it since they are on the land?
Okay, thanks. What did people farm and how did that play into decisions about what to farm and credit practices? I don't know yet. This is exactly the subject of my next chapter, actually, which I intend to go into in research. I think it's a key point. So sorry that I can't offer more of an answer at this stage. I know that livestock and maize were two major things. Livestock has always been an issue with very limited space for grazing. So actually in 94, the government was able to also acquire through the land reform program an additional piece of land for livestock grazing. As to more detail than that, to be continued. Sorry, what was the next question about buying land?
If there was any protection for buying land?
Yes, protection. So it's extraordinary that people were exploited even though they actually had receipts and so on that showed that they had bought land. Part of the problem was that because it was land being bought in installments, the claim made by Schlesinger and his attorneys was that, well, you haven't completed the purchase. The purchase is void. Your ownership rights are void unless you've completed all the installments for the purchase. what some people managed to do, for instance, the Harrismith group, was force the Native Farmers Association to at least give them a portion of land equivalent to what they had paid so far. So there were some families that were able to do that. So for instance, your question as well around Mamadlala and would they be given a chance to rebuy? The answer is that some of those families were able to acquire portions of the 10 morgan that they had paid for. They were often given the chance to rebuy, but again it was claimed, well, you're going to have to pay further because in the intervening years that you've been paying installments, the interest rates have gone up, your fees have gone up, you've used the services of certain lawyers. So there were all these other kind of spiraling costs that were mentioned, which people hadn't accounted for. I know that Seme himself, a lot of the loans that he had taken out involved spiraling costs in that the NFA hadn't anticipated for the cost of surveying and all these kind of hidden costs that go with land administration and land management, especially in a context where you're trying to do it with a very unsupportive government, as they were doing here. They were really kind of up against it. But what's fascinating, people have all those old receipts and title deeds over the years. And that was really important in the 1980s, where they were making these struggles, both like through the courts and also in terms of the media, that they were able to say, I've got this title deed that my grandparents bought in 1912, and we paid for it 3 times. Here it is, 1, 2, 3 kind of thing. So I think that, it's people were done wrong hugely, even though they had these documents. The motive behind buying land, very interesting question. One that I'm trying to get to the bottom of. So one of the things that people told me, and you may be familiar with the story as well, the Malloy, is that people often tell the story of a horse race when they talk about the origin story of Daggabrau. So they talk about a horse race that happened in 1911 on one of the farms, in which the horses that were owned by the black farmers won the race, but the white horse owners refused to recognize that black people's horses could win a race. And so they beat up the black horse owners for winning the race. The black horse owners took the white horse owners to court for assault. Seme represented them in court. This family were known as the Ngwenya brothers, the Ngwenya family, who were also related to Alexander Ngwenya, who was a friend of Seme, also in the ANC. And so that's the kind of story that people tell as to how Seme got involved, which I think is very interesting, because what people say is that Seme kind of said, look, we're unlikely to win this case for assault, even though it's clear and you're in the right. We're unlikely to get proper, even if we win it, we're unlikely to get proper compensation for it. If you really want to race horses, let's do it on our own land. Let's buy land where we can control what happens, and we don't have to be subject to this kind of racist society. So it's almost an attempt to carve out a space in the context of sort of very racist South Africa, in which black farmers could thrive in all senses, economically, sort of culturally, in terms of horse racing and entertainment. And it seems that this was kind of Seme's project, the possibility of building the space. I think that Seme and other members of the ANC were very aware of the legal gauntlet that they were facing. And I mean, Bongani's book is full of these fascinating stories of incredible legal acrobatics that Seme performed in order to hang on to the Native Farmers Association and in order for it to survive. So for instance, initially Seme, when it was questioned and it was said, well, black people can't own land in this form of a company, Seme said, well, companies are not racial things. A company cannot be racialized. This is not a black company, it is a company. So therefore we can own the land. And he won it. He won at least that initial case. So I think Seme and a lot of other ANC lawyers at the time also really believed in the power of law to try and carve out the space. Law was a vital part of the kind of armory. So I think, yeah, Tembeka and Taitwabi in his book also argues this to an extent. But there was a very strong kind of sense of legal, trying to protect black farmers' land through legal strategies. Something which other people became disenchanted with down the line, but not really at this point, I think.
I will use my power as a chair and ask two questions. First, I do not know whether you know that article by Tara Weinberg. It was in the Journal of African History 2009, where he reveals that actually after the 1920 Natives Land Act, more black people bought the land in the Transvaal than was the case before. And the reason why I raise it is because I'm interested in what happened to the Native Farmers Association after 1990. I mean, I wrote a bit about it in the book, because I have a suspicion that actually the people who bought the land again from Spencer now, this is after 1919, those are the people that Harvey Weinberg is talking about. That it was not new people who were buying the land, it was the same group of people who had bought the land before who were rebuying the land after the company was taken over by Spencer in 1990. I'm very interested because this has become a very influential article. I mean, so there is evidence that actually land ownership in the Transvaal increased after the Native Land Act in 1930, which is counterintuitive. Because you would think that if you people would buy the land after the Native Land Act, and so the evidence is there that more people bought the land. But I'm not too sure whether it was new land. It's just the same land. So I'm quite interested in what your view is on that. Then, second question. In the lead up to the Natives Land Act, when the Minister for Land, what was his name? When he was asked the parliamentary question, in 1912. Okay. Let's go back. This is 1912. And so he was asked the question, okay, we're about to pass this law. How many black people own land? I don't know whether we have come across this in the National Archive, but it was quite striking to me. Because it is a long list of black people who owned land, by 1912. I would say, I didn't do the count, but I think it is over 50. And the reason why I asked the question is, we know the story of the Native Farmers Association. I do not know whether we have come across information. Those people who had land, and some of them had more land than the Native Farmers Association. How did they buy that land? It's quite critical. And what happened to the land? Because I think when you check, most of those families do not have the land now. How do they lose it? We know in the case of the Native Farmers Association how the land was lost over time. And in the case of those families, we can't lose anything with respect to just questions. Any other questions, comments, questions?
Well, can I just say that Isaiah Shepard bought a lot of land in Natal, and he's very important because he also, there are very interesting theories about why he bought the land. Was it political? Was it his divine inspiration? But he was a very important figure. But he bought the land from someone else who got defaulted. I don't know.
Okay. Thanks. Yes, I think the example you referred to, the Nazareth Church, is an interesting model. I went into this project looking for more examples of that, but I've struggled to find them, of independent black churches that bought land almost as syndicates. Because there must be other examples in addition to Isaiah Shepard's church, but it it seemed like it would be a good route to go. I know that, so Vusi Kumalo, who's been working on the Wilberforce Institute in Everton, argues that the Wilberforce Institute and the AMA Church there, part of their role was also to buy up a whole lot of land in Everton, ostensibly for church purposes. But then people would buy into that scheme, individual families would buy houses and so on as part of that scheme as well. So maybe I'll take your questions backwards since we're on this topic. When you mentioned the 50 other people, were those individual families or syndicates? Do you know?
They come across as families,
Families,
because it's names of individuals. What is interesting in that list, in that long list, the Native Farmers Association is mentioned as the Native Farmers Association. I mean, Seme is mentioned as a facilitator, but the owner of the land is the Native Farmers Association. But in most cases, it is names of individuals. I mean, suggest that it was individuals themselves who owned the land.
Right.
I mean, that, I came across that file,
Yeah.
file about black land ownership a few years between the passing of the Natives Land Act. I thought that was quite fascinating. There was a large
I agree, yeah.
especially the Transvaal.
I'd like to find out more about that. The one family that comes to mind are the Nakane family who bought land at Klipgat. And I know they were listed as families rather than as a syndicate, although they did come together to sort of pool resources to buy that land. I'm trying to remember how they lost the land. I think it was through the forced removals process. They were also sharecroppers. So they're one example I can think of. The people who bought land at Mohopa would be another one to look into. They did form a kind of syndicate, but it may have been in the names of the individual families. That was quite a large area of land. Matopisat would be another one, where people bought land. Chief Matope, I think, and his wife were the famous figures there. A lot of these were like what the apartheid government called black spots. Yeah, where black farmers own land amongst white farmers. But I agree, it would be fascinating to look into that.
It's an MDE file. I'll have to go back to. I was hopefully on Friday to look at the file again. But it is the MDE file. I mean, I remember getting quite intrigued by it.
Yeah.
It's a long list of black land owners in 1920. It was like they were doing an audit. Okay, so we want to remove these black people who are in these spots and how many of them there are. And so they did the audit and gave a long list, including the Native Farmers Association. So it will be interesting.
It's fascinating, yeah. On the question of Harvey Feinberg's argument, I agree with you completely. I think he very much overstates the extent to which black people were able to buy land after 1913. I think a lot of what he's looking at are the exceptions issued by the Governor General's office. But a lot of these exceptions were not just for new land that people were buying from, say, white land sellers. They were also for land that was changing hands between black owners, or inheritance as well. So often inheritance I found in Dachapral and Driefontein would also had to go through the Governor General's office. So I found thousands of these exceptions in the archives for Dachapral and Driefontein. And I think that, what was often happening was that, as you said, people were having to buy land again, which they'd already bought, but now post-1913, you had to just exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And I think, or what happened was that people like Muhammad Lala's family lost land, and then other black land buyers came in and bought that land from them. Yeah, so it's the same land, just changing hands. So I think it's important to counter that.
Especially because it's become so influential.
Yeah.
It's argument that. Let's take this last